how important is it to have a common data language or data literacy or maybe statistical literacy within the organization to be able to scale experimentation similar to what you've done at American Express? So I'd love if you can maybe comment on the role that data skills, data literacy plays when it comes to being able to scale this culture of experimentation.
Look, I mean, data literacy is absolutely basic to an experimentation culture, right? And if different parts of the company has different definitions for what is in effect the same data, it's very hard to then compare results of experiments. If different parts of the funnel define the same item differently and it's not an unknown problem, that can be its own confounder, right? Because sometimes the experiment that you're running runs across teams that actually operate in different parts of the funnel. So practically, you need to be able to bring different teams together and have them speak the same language. I think it's also important to have very robust statistical standards. As I said, we usually leverage frequent test statistics. For this purpose, the statisticians on our team have looked at the corpus of experiments that we have run, and they have a set of standards that we enforce across all the experiments across the company. But it's also up to individual teams, because sometimes you have sample size issues, especially when you're running experiments in a completely new product or a completely new channel. You just may not have as much sample size. So would it necessarily make sense to have the same set of standards that you have for your primary product or your primary channels where traffic is usually not a problem? Probably that's a question to be answered by individual companies and individual teams on how to react to problems like that. But if you do not have that singular language of assessing experiment results, that can cause its own issues later on. So I would strongly recommend teams, before they get into a widespread experimentation across a large company, to have and set up those standards and make sure everybody aligns. Because again, that really defines which experiment is considered a success, or which experiment is considered inconclusive. And you do not want to change standards in the middle of a particular experiment. That can cause a lot of relationship issues, I can tell you.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then, you're talking about these standards, right? And I'm sure this is something that your team is the one that's kind of building these standards, advocating for them within the organization as part of kind of that overall statistical literacy that we've discussed. Maybe walk us through what those standards look like in a bit more depth. And, if you had like a magic wand, what does like statistical literacy look like within an organization that is operating at full cylinders when it comes to like experimentation?
I mean, I think, the statistical standards, I don't think they necessarily deviate much from the textbooks that you can pick up on designs of experiments, right? But I do think a few things change. I can give an example, and this is an example that's perhaps a little hypothetical, but hopefully makes sense. What is the cost of reading an experiment result inaccurately, say for a financial services company, for an e-commerce company versus a pharmaceutical company? If you are a pharmaceutical company, and by the way, I have no experience working for a pharmaceutical company, so this is a hypothetical example. People could die if the way you have looked at the data and you have used statistical standards that are not aligned with standards regulators require. You could be, as a company, be sued out of existence. Now, if you are trying to improve conversion rates in a funnel, that's a somewhat different type of impact. Yes, you could have a financial loss, but you will not be losing, you'll not be impacting people's lives in a way that's extremely detrimental. So your ability to accept errors in experiment result readout depends on which part of the funnel you're operating in, what is the business question you're trying to answer, how critical it is for you to have the right answer. The degree of confidence ultimately determines, the standards that you put in. So there's probably not one single answer that I can give. We understand the different needs different business units and different parts of a funnel have, and based on that, we have set up standards.
And you're hinting here at kind of different standards across different teams, and you've also mentioned previously, when you were discussing, is that depending on the area, the channel, the product, the standards of experimentation may be different, but as well, the kind of how you approach experiments may be different. I remember Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, mentioned once the limits of experimentation, especially when venturing into new areas, right? There's not a lot of data that you can work with if you're in a completely new area to run experiments on. So maybe can you walk us through the limits of experimentation? At what point is there maybe too much reliance on experimentation or too much experimentation happening? So I'd love to see kind of the counterpoint here.
Yeah, no, I personally, I love Airbnb, and it's amazing, the business that Airbnb has built over such a short time, and the brand it has created. Um, I have to say, I don't necessarily agree with the statement that there can be too much experimentation, but I do think what Brian wanted to say is that experimentation cannot answer every question, and not every situation can be converted into a specific experiment. So there is always this need to rely on business intuition. But in effect, business intuition also helps you choose the path you want to take. And some of those are very difficult to decide ahead of time or experiment into. In certain cases, I certainly believe it is absolutely critical for business leaders to take a stand, especially when they are thinking of completely net new markets, net new products, disruptive processes, disruptive products. It's hard to experiment into that level of specificity and gain enough knowledge without significant investments. And those, sometimes, yes, it's possible to experiment into disruptive change, but usually that is very difficult. You have taken a decision that you must follow through, and it's the path that you take that determines success there. So yes, I would have to agree with him that there are certain areas where it is not possible to experiment, but in almost all other areas where you know what you want, you have some prior knowledge, you have the infrastructure and the willingness to experiment, it's usually a better way of answering questions than taking a shot in the dark and relying entirely on intuition.